Today I'm having my own mini making throwdown. I'm going to use two methods to make tiny pots. The first is throwing on a regular wheel off the hump versus throwing on a mini wheel. So the first method is throwing off the hump. So I think making tiny pots is a great way to get started with this method. So to throw off the hump, we center a larger piece of clay than we need, and then we make a bunch of small pots off this piece of clay. I'm sectioning off a small piece of clay at the top of the hump. This is the clay I'll use to make my mini bowl. So I'm going to use a small paintbrush handle to push down into the clay and then open up. So now I can use my fingers to pull the walls up and to shape my pot a little more. So from here, it's pretty much like making a regular pot, just on a much smaller scale. It will be a little different when it comes time to cut our pot off the hump. So now I'm just trimming a little around the base. One of the things you do have to be aware of when working with this method is how much clay you have in the base. So you have kind of an imaginary bottom on which the clay is sitting, and you need to be aware of how far you push down, and then of course where you're going to cut the pot through. So now I'm just compacting around the base a little, partly because we don't have a chance to compress against a bat, and now I'm ready to wire through. So I'm just cutting straight through and lifting the mini bowl off the wheel. So let's try a bottle now. I'm preparing a small section of clay on the hump and pushing down as I did earlier. Now I'm pulling up the walls. I'm using the tool on the inside because obviously I can't get my fingers in there. So I'm using the paintbrush tool like a very small finger. And I'm just pulling up more clay. And now I'm using a rib to straighten the sides. Now I'm ready to start collaring in at the neck. So gently collaring in and still using my throwing stick on the inside when I need to. So throw a little and then collar. I'm using a sponge here. I want quite a tall, elegant neck, so collaring takes a little while. As you can see, my hump of clay has gotten quite small here. I should also point out that I'm using a porcelain here for throwing. This really helps making tiny pots, as any grit or coarseness in the clay will make it difficult to shape and refine your pots. It tends to tear at your pieces. As you can see here, tall upright forms can wobble a little alarmingly, but you just steady it. And now I'm ready to wire through. This time I'm wrapping my wire all the way around the pot and pulling the two ends to cut. So I'm going to let these dry, and as they dry I'll gently finish the bases with a sponge. So now I'm ready to try out a mini wheel. So I've prepared a very small lug of clay and I'm just pressing it down onto the wheel head before I start. This is a very simple mini wheel. There are many types around. This one just has an on-off switch and reverse and a knob that allows you to dial up the speed. I've wet my hands and I'm now just centering my tiny piece of clay, just pushing in, and you can see I'm centering a little differently. I'm not bringing the clay up as far. And as you can see, this wheel doesn't have a pan and the clay is splattering off. I'm right at the splatter line, so this is super messy. Okay, so I'm still preparing the clay here. You can also carve the clay away a little, that works too. And I feel that I am just about ready to push down and open out. I guess if you're doing a lot of this, you could invest in some tools, some tiny tools for pot making. But as you can see, I'm just using the end of my fine paintbrush. You can also use skewers. And so I'm just pushing down and putting out a little. Now I'm pulling up a tiny bit. So this one's going to be really tiny. So I'm guessing if you watched this far, I don't need to answer the question as to why you would make tiny pots. So a few people I've spoken to this about find them maybe a little twee, but they're missing the point. Tiny pots are really fun to make and they allow you to experiment with different techniques and methods. And there is no doubt, tiny things are just cute. Some of the techniques here are useful if you are, for example, throwing a spout for a teapot. So because this pot is so tiny, I'm using a paintbrush to smooth the side. Now I'm ready to trim and wire through. So it's time to decorate and I'm just applying some tissue transfers. I have some little bits of tissue transfer left over from different projects, so I'm just using them up. As you can see, along with the bottle and the bowls, I've also made a little porcelain table and a plant pot. So these have been fired to a stoneware temperature. They've shrunk a little more and they are tiny. So how did the two experiences stack up? Well, throwing off the hump on the big wheel was easier. Perhaps that's just because I'm used to my wheel. I felt I had more control. It definitely felt like making regular pots. The tiny wheel felt a little different. It felt like I had less control, and it felt more like I was trimming clay away rather than moving clay around. So this has been a little intro to throwing tiny. I might make some more videos on this topic. Feel free to comment and of course like. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. It's much appreciated. Thanks for watching and happy potting at whatever size.